tonight's virtual Civil War presentation brought to you by CivilWarTalk.com. Tonight's guest is Jerry T Wooten, discussing his book, Johnsonville, Union Supply Operations on the Tennessee River and the Battle of Johnsonville, November 4th to 5th, 1864, released by Savas Beatty in the fall of 2019. The series is provided by CivilWarTalk.com. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you'll enjoy the program tonight. We're pleased to bring these fantastic authors and programs to you via the live virtual platform. If you aren't already a member of Civil War Talk, we'll be telling you how to become a member later on in the program. I hope everyone will join the Civil War Talk community.
Our guest tonight is Jerry T Wooten, PhD, the park manager for Bicentennial Capitol Mall State Park in Nashville, Tennessee. He served as park manager at Johnsonville State Historic Park, as director of state historic sites for the Tennessee Historical Commission, and as park historian at the Pamplin Historical Park and National Museum of the Civil War Soldier in Petersburg, Virginia. Jerry is a Clarksville, Tennessee native who obtained his PhD in American history from Middle Tennessee State University. He has researched, written, and presented programs about the Civil War for most of his professional life. He serves on the Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association's Board of Directors and is a frequent speaker at Civil War roundtables, historical organizations, state and national parks and museums. Tonight, Dr. Wooten will be discussing his latest book, Johnsonville, Union Supply Operations on the Tennessee River and the Battle of Johnsonville, November 4th through the 5th, 1864, released by Savas Beatty in 2019. Johnsonville may not mean much to most students of the Civil War, yet its contribution to the Union victory in the Western Theater is difficult to overstate, and its history is complex, fascinating, and heretofore mostly untold. Wooten remedies that oversight with his book, which is the first full-length treatment of this subject. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jerry T. Wooten.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
I hear you. You're good.
I'm hoping I have audio. So, well, hey, thank you so much, Tina and Laura, for that fantastic introduction. It's so nice to actually be at a meeting with people where I'm not having to do this and talk to everybody like this, where we don't get that visual effect from mouths moving for the next hour. So it's quite a treat to be done with this thing for at least the next 8 hours. But anyway, thank you so much for having me tonight. It's always a pleasure to be here to talk about my book and about this incredible story. Just a little bit of background before I do have a PowerPoint. I've learned over the years by doing presentations that having visual aids leaves a lasting impression. It gives you something, an aid, a visual to remember the story by. So I like teaching. Some people don't. I actually do like teaching and presenting with PowerPoints and any kind of visual aid that I can have. So I've got some really good slides and original photographs and a lot of neat things that I dug up that had never been seen while I was writing this book. And speaking of the book, as Tina mentioned, I had previously been the manager at Johnsonville State Park. And it was at that time that I was actually studying to finish my PhD in history at Middle Tennessee University. And for those of you who have been through that or have not, you probably know that, doing that kind of research, you have to come up with an original topic. And it just fit that since I was the manager of this incredible park that had this wonderful story to be told that had been sprinkled around for 100 years in Confederate Veteran Magazine and Civil War Times and Civil War Journal, but it never had a full treatment done to it correctly. I just thought this just has to be told. And it was the story of the Battle of Johnsonville, but it also included telling what the entire process of how it came to be, why it was there, and eventually what happened had never been told. And I was just amazed that nobody had picked up this story. So I thought, gosh, what a wonderful topic for my dissertation that eventually became a book. This endeavor, I started initial research in 2011. And of course, I finished it last year. It was published in November of 2019. So for 8 years of my life, I just basically went head deep right into all of this research, moving all over the country, meeting wonderful people, talking to a lot of the ancestors who had their ancestors here at Johnsonville, and was able to use a lot of their documentation in my research to come up with what I did. So hopefully, if you do have the book or you haven't, I hope you do get a copy of it. That's not a sales pitch, but it is worth me telling you that I'm very proud of this book. And I hope when you do get a chance to read the story, you'll find out more than you probably knew about this incredible engagement that took place on the border of the Tennessee River in 1864. The other interesting thing before we get into the slide program is that as I was beginning to write this, it was the kickoff to the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War. And Johnsonville sits basically halfway between Fort Donelson and Shiloh, Tennessee. Tennessee, as you know, is a very narrow state. And if you've never been to the state and you're not quite familiar with the geography of the state, Johnsonville sits right on the border of West Tennessee. That's basically the Tennessee River splits the state in half. And Johnsonville is almost dead smack in the middle, 78 miles west of Nashville. So in a lot of ways, it's a Middle Tennessee story, but it's also a West Tennessee story because a lot of the operations that took place from the Confederates generated in West Tennessee, and then they moved downriver on that side, on that end of the state, eventually attacking the Johnsonville Supply Depot on November 4th, 1864. Another ironic thing is that 156 years ago today, these Confederates under Nathan Bedford Forrest started this campaign. They started a little bit earlier on the route there, but the first engagement just over the border in Kentucky at a place called Fort Hyman, that I'll show you some slides tonight that references that, took place on October 28, 1864. So we're here to the very day, which I know for you all, for Civil War historians, that means a lot. It means a lot to me to actually be talking about events on the actual dates. And ironically, too, during that time in 1864, there was a national election going on. As tumultuous as this one is right now, the McClellan-Lincoln election was happening 1 week from now. It was going to unfold on November the 8th, 1864. So basically, during the same process, they were, you had McClellan and Lincoln that had been battling it out. And of course, McClellan was running on the fact that if he would win, he would end the war immediately. So there were a lot of opinions and reactions to that election going on at that time, just as it is now. So I think it's ironic to be here tonight telling this story in the midst of an election, just like it was 156 years ago. So with that, Laura, I think if I can let's get on to the slideshow, and I'm going to have some time after my presentation for questions, and I hope you will ask some questions, but I'm going to run through this, and I'm not going to run through it. There's a lot of detail in some of the photographs and some of the information that I'm going to share. And I challenge everybody, if you'd like to take notes, feel free to take notes, and I want to certainly answer your questions, but I'm going to be telling this story from how Johnsonville evolved to eventually how it ended, and then what happened eventually a little bit after the post-war. So I'll be showing mostly of the Civil War era and the battle and the culmination of what became Johnsonville. And then I'll show you a little bit about post-Civil War Johnsonville and what happened to it, and then I'll wrap it up after that. This will be somewhere between 45 and 50 minutes, so I hope you hang in there. I know all of you are sports about this. You're just like me when it comes to Civil War history. You can sit here for 3 hours, so I promise I won't keep you into that routine. So, Laura, if we can get started here, we'll go to the, let me see. Okay. So can everybody see that? I see some nods going over there. I didn't want to be complicated with the title. I mean, the place, which eventually was named after Andrew Johnson, was named by the man himself, called Johnsonville. So I wanted to keep it simple. And just, I was when I was talking to the publisher about the book, since this was the first full-length treatment on the subject, it was very important to me to have the title, the word Johnsonville, just plastered in big bold letters right across the top of the book. Because just like Shiloh and just those defining words that mean so much when you talk about Civil War, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, I wanted Johnsonville to be right there as well. So that was one of the goals. And then, of course, the subtitle was challenging. I had, like most authors do, I went through a series of subtitles and eventually came up with the one that I did, because it really was about Union supply operations. That's why the place existed. It was on the Tennessee River. There was a battle, and there were dates that are associated with that battle. So it was very important for me to get that right up front. So just, I'm going to give you sort of a real quick rundown about what happened. But Johnsonville, it was a Union supply depot. It was constructed basically as a quick fix solution. It was done late in the Civil War, in August of 1863. It eventually became the largest supply operation built along the Tennessee River during the American Civil War. Now, most of you have heard of the Big City Point, Virginia supply depot. It was not as massive as that, but in the Western Theater, Johnsonville was a subsidiary to the Grand Nashville Depot. So you had the depot in Louisville, Kentucky, you had St. Louis, you had the big one in Cincinnati. But as you came south, the supply operation for the Army of the Cumberland under George Thomas was operated and was basically administered out of Nashville, Tennessee. So you had this Grand Nashville, Tennessee supply depot that operated these little offshoots at places like Gallatin, Tennessee, Hendersonville, Tennessee, Deckard. You had one in Decatur, Alabama, and you went west to a place on the Tennessee River, eventually where what became Johnsonville. And that story basically happened because in 1862, if you are familiar, as most of you probably are, with the Western Theater, the history of the Western Theater, Federal forces captured Nashville very early on, shortly after the Battle of Fort Donelson in February of 1862. Shortly after that, on March the 3rd, Lincoln appoints staunch Unionist in Tennessee and Andrew Johnson as a military governor of Tennessee. Now, military governorships were new. It had been tried in Louisiana and failed, and it had been tried just months before this. So it was a stretch once again for Lincoln to appoint a military governor in charge of Tennessee. And being a military governor meant, just like the governor today, you're running the administrative duties of the state, but you also are in charge of the military actions going on, especially in wartime. So knowing that Johnson was loyal, and he was a very loyal Unionist from Tennessee, Lincoln knew that would probably be a good step. So that's a big part of this story is Johnson becoming the military governor. And of course, his office is in that state building that you see up there in the right-hand corner, my right-hand corner. That is the Tennessee State Capitol. That is basically where I work today. I work on the grounds of this beautiful Capitol every day. I look right out my office window at this grand building. It's Tennessee's most historic building, and designed and built by William Strickland and completed just before the war in 1859. But Andrew Johnson would eventually occupy that building, running operations as military governor. And just down the hill, you see a train depot. This is the main Nashville train depot. You see one of the trains that eventually would leave Nashville. This particular route, we think, is part of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. The railroad that I'm going to be introducing you tonight is an offshoot of this particular railroad where you see this train yard. All the buildings that you see in this photograph are pretty much gone. If you're familiar with Nashville, the brick buildings just below the hill from the Capitol is the campus of Tennessee State University today. But all the buildings that you see in this photograph that are visible here, except the state Capitol, no longer exist. And again, if you are familiar with Nashville, this is right off Charlotte Avenue as it comes up Capitol Hill, going to the state Capitol. You come down Charlotte Avenue, this is where that location is. And this It sits approximately about 300 yards from my office, where the state capitol is located. So I want to try to answer some of your questions just in the PowerPoint, but why was Johnsonville needed? So in 1862, the Union commanders feared that the Cumberland River may be too shallow to support these deep draft supply vessels due to a severe drought. Nashville was very important very early on in the war because it was a railroad hub, but even more importantly, it was a river hub. And they knew that they could build a base of supply operations here using the Cumberland River as a channel to filter supplies out to various areas. When they saw that there was a possibility that the Cumberland River was not going to be utilized, this changed the whole game, and it even made it a consideration among Union commanders to decide whether or not if they could maintain Nashville as a base of operations because of the shallow depth of the river that summer in 1862. It got very low. This is a really good photograph. It was taken in 1875, it's 10 years after the war, but this is First Street. This is where all the honky tonks and all the country music bars and things are today. But this is right on the riverfront. And this does show you Nashville's wharf, Water Street, in 1875. And this is a pretty good reflection of probably what it looked like during the Civil War era. You see a lot of the food, you see a lot of the supplies and stores that are stockpiled on the wharf. This would have been a very common scene in the Civil War. I think this is just a fantastic photograph. The steamboats docked up on the right. All the buildings that you see to the left of the street are still intact today. So I hate to I almost sound like I'm a billboard for Nashville tourism right now, but it is an incredible view. If you stand on that riverfront today, a lot of those fronts are still the same. Some of them have changed, but you still get that view today. So anyway, so to resolve the supply issue, Johnson and the Union commanders decided to construct an alternative base of supply west on the deeper channel Tennessee River. As I mentioned earlier, Nashville is 78 miles directly, 78 to 80 miles to the Tennessee River, a straight shot west. So the site chosen was a previously existing riverboat landing that had been constructed in the 1830s called Lucas Landing, and that is located in Humphreys County. This is one of those really rare finds that came to me while I was doing my research. This is a photograph of Johnsonville about 1918, and you can see the building off to the right, but what's more important is it shows you the Tennessee River channel as it looked during the Civil War before TVA flooded the region to form Kentucky Lake as it is today. So what you're looking at is a span of about 370 yards across, and that wood line that you see across the river is where Forrest and his Confederates would eventually set up to attack Johnsonville on November the 4th, and we'll get into that. This is Humphreys County in Tennessee. I've got it highlighted in red, so just to kind of put the geography to make a little more sense, that shows you where Johnsonville was. If you see the little red hump off to the left on the west side, right before the edge of the little circle, the hump, that is where Johnsonville is located. So you can see two more counties down was Pittsburgh Landing, where Shiloh is. And at the top of that same line where you see the hump at the top of the state of Tennessee, that's Stewart County, where Fort Donelson is. So Johnsonville sat directly between the rivers, Fort Henry on the Tennessee, Fort Henry's and Donelson being on the Cumberland, and then followed the Tennessee River all the way down to the bottom of Hardin County where Pittsburgh Landing was located. So hopefully that sets you up of the area where we're talking about. So in 63, the Army, under the authority of Governor Johnson, begins construction. They decide to build a railroad to the Tennessee River to connect Nashville with the supply depot that is not called Johnsonville yet. It's still Lucas Landing. So this construction begins in August of 1863. Now, Colonel William Ennis, who is at that time is the commander of the U.S. Military Railroad Department in Tennessee, he's ordered by Johnson to oversee completion of what eventually becomes known as the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad. This railroad existed before the Civil War. It started in the 1850s, It stopped due to financial reasons, and it picks it back up again at this time in 1863. So Uss is in charge, overseeing the construction of the project. Now, earlier that year in February, Johnson did assign engineers of the the famed First Missouri Engineers, to begin construction, some of the design work on the railroad. So he had plans even before they decided that the Cumberland River could not be used to construct this railroad to be used as a supply route. Now, excuse me, I was bouncing around. Uss he's eventually replaced by Daniel McCallum by Grant in 1864. You know, the Union suffers a defeat at the Battle of Chickamauga, and his demands are needed greater down on the Nashville and Chattanooga line. So he's pulled off of the project, and McCallum is brought in to help complete the railroad, that eventually makes its way to Johnsonville. And this is a photograph of McCallum. He had done work previously in Ohio on a lot of the canals in the north, had a very good reputation for canal, and eventually got into railroad construction, and had worked. Grant, he was a friend of Grant's, and he knew Grant, and Grant was quite familiar with his work. So that's one of the reasons he brought him down, gives him the rank of a brigadier general, and then he helps finish the creation and the construction of the Nashville Railroad, Nashville Northwestern Railroad. So labor is a big part of this story, and where to get the labor in the middle of the war, where most of the troops are being used on the front, is a big problem. There's just not the labor that's needed to finish and construct the railroad. So they look to free black men from local communities in and around Nashville to supply the labor to build this railroad. This is one of those photos. I love this photograph. If you'll look carefully at this man, at this African-American man, he is a laborer. He is clothed in a 4-button Union sack coat without the brass buttons. You see the shredded sleeves on the end. You can see the stain on his shirt in the front. I mean, he is a laborer. This is probably what many of the impressed laborers that were impressed into service look like. And to give a quick definition of impressment, impressment is really a naval term. It had been going on in the British Navy for many years. And then, of course, it transfers into use of the Army. But impressment basically is military force taking civilian populace. In this case, the population that was around Nashville were many freed blacks. They were available labor. So under order of Johnson, he orders Union commanders and officers in and around the Nashville area to move into those communities, cities such as Ashland City, Pulaski, Tennessee, Gallatin that I mentioned earlier, and really going into church services on Sunday, going into homes at night, and impressing these men, usually with their families, into servitude, into service for the Union Army to go down and start construction on the railroad. So this would have been a common scene in late summer 1863, especially September, eventually impressing 7,300 free blacks to conduct the labor on the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad. A lot of you as Civil War historians are familiar with this photograph. This is a stage photograph like most Civil War photographs, but it shows probably impressed black men working on a railroad in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Well, we do know this is documented to Murfreesboro in around 1863, but this would have been a common scene. This is what you would have seen on the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad from Nashville to Johnsonville in the middle to late fall of 1863, all the way into 1864. This is how they would have been constructing the railroad, hewing out logs that you see there, very primitive looking rails. They were using rails by the U shape. which was quite common at that time. And you can see the construction details. There was no steam shovels in those days. It's pickaxes and shovels. So you can see a similar roadbed that they would have constructed. And when they were finished, let's see. Yeah, I talked about the First Missouri Engineers a little bit earlier. This is one of those wonderful hand-drawn maps that I was able to uncover during my research. This shows an officer drew this map, but it shows you, if you look off to the left, you see Nashville. If you look to the left, you see Nashville and Northwestern Railroad. I love his little notes that he writes up to the top. It says, in fair condition, 78 miles in possession of military, built September 1863. And if you look at that, if you look at Nashville and Northwestern Railroad, right out of Nashville, you see a loop that loops down to the left. At the bottom of that loop to the Tennessee River is exactly 50 miles. So they had to finish that 50 miles within a matter of what Johnson estimated based on what his engineers told him in 1 year. So there had been 28 miles of track. If you recall, the railroad had started in the 1850s that had been built out of Nashville already. So they were trying to connect the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad to the Tennessee River in less than a year. And when I do these presentations around the country, I tell people, I really try to hit home that this is probably one of the greatest engineering feats in the entire Civil War. They built this railroad over watery, swampy terrain and had it completed in less than a year, less than 12 months. So you can imagine trying to do that. You know, the CSX Railroad still uses the same railroad bed today. And I can't, for the life of me, figure out how they could build as many trestles as they did over the swampy terrain to complete this railroad. But they were able to keep it on time, on a time schedule, and finish it within Johnson's wishes. And it was completed in September of 1864. So moving past that, this is not the Western Theater. This is a photograph in Virginia, but I used it because it does show you probably what that looked like. You see, it's a real narrow gauge. We're talking probably 11 to 12 feet wide. That's it. And you can see it was just cut right out of the middle of the woods. That would have been the typical site that you would have seen on the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad in 1863. This is very common of what it would have looked like. This is Colonel Wharton's map of the area. Now, this does show you the Tennessee River. If you see the red line going off to my right, your left maybe, that red line eventually went to Nashville. This is a huge map, and I've cut it in half to show you the Tennessee River section. But if you look to your left, you see Johnsonville. And this, by the way, folks, this is a period map. This is an 1865 map. Just north of there, you see a town called Reynoldsburg. The Army had initially planned to take the railroad to Reynoldsburg, and there had been some track laid, and you can see a road, or what appears to be a railroad, going to Reynoldsburg. But instead, they decided to divert that and move it to Johnsonville because the landing at Lucas Landing was very wide. And if you look at the Tennessee River right there, they have a command view of the Tennessee River 2 miles in either direction. So they could see any kind of approaching vessel or any of the enemy that might be approaching by water. It was heavily forested across the river, so they never dared think that an attack would take place upon the depot from across the river, but much to their surprise, as we'll find out. So on May the 19th, the depot had been under construction just like the railroad, and Andrew Johnson and a party of civilians, including the mayor of Nashville, ride the first train from the middle of Nashville, from that depot that I showed you earlier, to the Tennessee River. And they arrived at Lucas Landing. They left at 6 o'clock in the morning, arrived there about 1 in the afternoon. And on that train, Johnson purposely had a number of newspaper reporters from Nashville newspapers because he really wanted to make a big splash that the depot was completed and the railroad was a usable railroad. Now, the military did not take full control of the railroad until September the 1st, 1864. So about 4 months after this, the military railroad, it becomes a military railroad. But right now it's still just the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad. Anyway, while he's there, He gives a dedicatory speech, supposedly on the back of a caboose. They say wine was flowing like water. They say that there was cigars and lemonades and sandwiches and cigars lavishly distributed throughout the rail cars. Johnson supposedly stepped out on the back of this caboose, and a gathered crowd, probably of just laborers at the supply depot, he makes this flowery dedicatory speech. And one of the depictions supposedly is this woman appears out of the crowd with a bottle of wine, and somehow he grabs the bottle of wine, holds it over his head, and of course, being a new railroad, there are railroad ties and steel rails laying around, and he steps off the caboose and he smashes it just like a new ship. And he says, "I hereby claim this place Johnsonville." So I've always thought, God, how great would that be to just, you pay for a place and you arrive there and you get to name it after yourself. So that's basically how it came about. And really, right after that, right after May, you started seeing military correspondence from June 1864 on to the end of the war that was being printed with Johnsonville letterhead. So the name stuck, and that's how the place got its name. And to this day, Johnsonville is a state park, but on top of the hill is a town called New Johnsonville. And I'll get into that just a little bit later, but it's still there today. In 1864, and I hope David is on here, I invited him, but David Meager is the fantastic artist that did this sketch, putting together Civil War photographs that shows what the Johnsonville Depot looked like, a bird's eye view in 1864. You see the two massive supply warehouses right down there on the riverfront. You see the steep wharf. You see the number of supply transport boats that are docked to the left. You also see a number of tin-clad gunboats down in the foreground that will play a big part of our story shortly. And you also see back off to the left what eventually became the town of Johnsonville. So if you can just picture this place, you have it's just a 90-acre depot protected by a fort up there on top of the hill. The roundhouse that you see off to the left, and I'm sorry I can't have a pointer, is a railroad turntable where when the trains came in to pick up supplies, it would turn the trains around, and I'll show you a photo of that in just a minute. And then, of course, you have what's commonly used in a military camp. You see soldiers' barracks and tents. You see officer administrative buildings just below the fort. And then, of course, you see the railroads coming in. Eventually, in my research, I was able to uncover, that was not in David's drawing in 1992, that there were barracks at Johnsonville. So there were 11 soldier barracks that I will also show you in just a minute. But that gives you, this is such a great drawing, and it became a centerpiece in the museum. So if you do take a trip down to Johnsonville State Park and you visit the museum, be sure to go through their wonderful museum. You'll see this bird's eye view blown up to a massive scale. So this is quite a convoluted story. I'm going to try in the time we've got here to tell you how this comes together. But the U.S. Quartermaster's Department runs the supply operations and the wharf at Johnsonville. So you have the U.S. Navy, you have the U.S. Army, you have the U.S. Quartermaster's Department that also they're the ones that operated the supply shipments and the Teamsters and everything that it took to run a supply operation, all in one big happy family in a 90-acre supply depot. I'm sure that just went along quite well with everybody every day, especially when you had Navy and Army guys trying to work together. So you had coupled together with that, you had officers that were coming in and out of there. You had impressed laborers. And then you had the civilian town that built up on the outskirts of the military depot. So just like many of the military bases today, Fort Bragg, Fort Campbell, you have civilian towns that grow up right outside the military base working as civilians for the Army. That's exactly going on in 1864 at Johnsonville. So this right here, this is a fantastic photograph. This is the Nashville Taylor Supply Depot. This is their clothing depot. So, you had a ration depot, you had clothing depot, you had, areas for horse tack, you had areas where they kept, fodder for the horses. this is such a wonderful photo. And again, for those of you who've been to Nashville, if you've been down to the Country Music Hall of Fame, where the Country Music Hall of Fame sits today, right in downtown Nashville, is the location of where this building is today in 1864. And if you follow the railroad track, you see the state capitol, and you also see the Episcopal Church steeples just off to the back end of the roof of this building. This, of course, was destroyed after the Civil War, like much of the Civil War history of Nashville. But just a fantastic find in our wonderful archives. This again is not Johnsonville. I believe this is Chattanooga, but it does kind of give you a representation of maybe what the wharf at Johnsonville looked like. So over the Nashville Depot, who was an officer in the U.S. Quartermaster's Department running the Nashville Depot, was Colonel James Donelson. Now, he was a classmate and personal friend of Montgomery Meigs, who was the Quartermaster General for the whole Union forces. And he places Donelson in charge of the Nashville Depot. So ultimately, Colonel James Donelson is in charge of the Johnsonville Supply Depot. You'll eventually have a number of assistant quartermasters that are at the site, but Johnsonville is ran under the oversight of this man, and he did a pretty effective job. Donelson was very effective and oversaw all those operations. So this, just for your knowledge, Donelson eventually is the man that's over the Johnsonville Supply Depot. The main assistant quartermaster at Johnsonville was this man, Henry Howland. He had been appointed assistant quartermaster at Johnsonville and shared a quarters there with his brother, Walter Howland. And their letters, I was able to get most of their letters for my research, and they wrote a tremendous amount of detail that I was able to uncover to use for the interior research of Johnsonville. So a lot of when you get the book and you're reading about the Howlands' letters, a lot of that information that I'm using to describe the interior of the depot came from these gentlemen's letters. So what was at Johnsonville? What came through there? You had uniforms for the troops. You had accoutrements like haversacks and canteens, everything to keep an army moving. Rifles, priming caps, ammunition. You had blankets. I took a photograph of this. I think this was in Maine. Yeah, the Bangor Museum. This is an actual Johnsonville blanket. I couldn't believe it. It was labeled Johnsonville, Tennessee. So I got their permission to use it in my slideshow. But this shows you a late war blanket in 1864 that the Army was being issued. It was a tan blanket with a big worsted wool letters sewn right in the middle, U.S. So there you go. That's an actual artifact. Army bread hardtack was coming through there by the thousands, crates of thousands of them. I mentioned City Point, Virginia a while ago. There's a common scene at Johnsonville. You have seen this all day long at Johnsonville, just crates of hardtack and supplies. Another fantastic map. This is a period map. It does show the map of the forts that existed at Johnsonville. There was a lower fort and an upper fort, referred to together as Fort Johnson. They were also referred to as a lower redoubt and an upper redoubt. And a redoubt is simply usually a 3 to 4 sided smaller fort that have embrasures cut into them where cannons could be slid forward and fired at oncoming enemy. They were separated about 350 yards apart, and the upper fort, based on its name, sat on a higher hill that overlooked the Tennessee River. So as I explained earlier, the reason they chose Lucas Landing was to have that view. Those gunners that were positioned in the upper fort could see all the way down the Tennessee River in both directions. The lower fort still had a commanding view, but you can see that the 90 acres that made Johnsonville truly was a circular cutout of a heavily wooded area. And this is a pretty detailed map of what you would have seen. 2 more drawings by David Meager. Just fantastic etches that show what the forts look like. You see the lower redoubt, the first one on the left, the smaller one, and then the upper one, which is the upper fort. You can see what it looked like. And there was 4 gun positions there, and each of these forts had a magazine. And I know the park has when I was there, and I know Bob Holliday, who's the manager there today, has been doing continual research on this. And kudos to Bob and his staff in continuing the preservation of these fantastic resources that are there today. And I think I've got a photo later that shows you that, what they look like. We're very lucky at Johnsonville to have 5 existing photographs from the Western Theater. Most of the Civil War photographs that you see are taken, as you know, in the Eastern Theater and the Atlanta campaign. But Jacob Coonley, who actually was one of the Western Theater photographs, was the person who made his way to Johnsonville and took the 5 iconic photographs that I'm about to show you beginning in 1864. Coonley, just real quickly, had been an ornamental sign painter before the war, and after the panic of 1857, it led him into a more lucrative daguerreotype photography, and he studied with another photographer, George Bernard, who also took photographs around Atlanta and Nashville. So he was his protege and eventually became a fantastic photographer later on in life after war, photographing most of the famous early pictures that you see of Key West, Florida. But Jacob Coonley takes the 5 photographs that I'm about to show you. This is number 1. This is that hillside. If you look up at the very top, you'll see a lone soldier standing up there in a poncho. He's standing on the wall of the lower fort. What's important about this photo, it's completely clear cut. There's no trees anywhere. I can't imagine what the erosion would have been like there. But you see at the base of the hill, you see administrative buildings, probably officer barracks. The building in the middle of the photo, the long one, appears to me to be a barrack. I have enhanced that, and you can see loopholes in the wall, and loopholes are where soldiers, if they were under attack, could close the shuttered windows and slide their rifles through a loophole and fire back at the enemy. And that building has it. And you can see them very clearly when you enhance that. Just thank God for digital photography and the ability to really enlarge this. Some of these photographs were such quality, I was able to enlarge them where you can actually see the faces of the men standing in the door stoops and the windows of this photograph. But this is one of 5 that existed. Now we know likely when Coonley arrived at Johnsonville, he took more photographs than just 5, and I'm sure like so many of the Civil War photograph collections, they were lost or destroyed, and those plates were missing. So if any of you out there have a lost Johnsonville photograph, please give me a call or write me. Laura knows how to get in touch with me. This is what it looks like today. So here's 1864, and if you see where the wheel is in the middle of the photograph, I'm going to change photo, keep that wheel in your mind, and when I go to the next photo, that platform that you see there is the same road platform behind the wheel. So it's just amazing that you can still go there today. Of course, the buildings are gone, but you still see the landscape, and that hill that you see in the background that's in the woods is the same hill where you see the barracks with the loopholes. It's just a fantastic resource. And of course, we're looking at it 150 years later. That's a nice forested park today, but it's still an amazing resource to be able to go there and look at it as it looked in 1864, probably. This is the second photograph. This is my favorite because it is the only known existing photograph of the town of Johnsonville. So if you see the hillside in your foreground, Coonley is standing up there with his assistant, probably with his camera on a tripod. He took the photograph that I showed you earlier and he swung it around and he snapped this photo looking back toward the town. And it shows the only known existing photograph, civilian town of Johnsonville. So that is the town that I mentioned earlier where the civilians that worked inside the supply depot lived. This is also very interesting. This is 3 weeks after the battle. We know that he took these plates exactly because they're etched on the back. I've looked at the originals at the Library of Congress, and they say November the 23rd. So if that truly was November the 23rd, and this is 3 weeks after the battle, it's often led me to believe, why is there not a shingled roof on this building in the foreground with the tarps that are draped over it? We do know that the fires swept across the depot. You see charred trees in the background. You see evidence of war, of that battle that takes place here. The fantastic thing that I love about this photo the most, and I'm sorry I can't use a pointer on here, but if you'll look at the railroad track in the foreground, you see these black dots. Well, when I enhanced the photograph and looked at those black dots, those are shoes. And the railroad is just littered with brogans. These are shoes that are just dotted everywhere. And it's just amazing that you had the Confederate Army, you know, that took on the entire Battle of Gettysburg for the purpose of shoeing their army. And it just shows you the massive amount of this Union war machine in the fall of 1864 that, you know, a few extra shoes that happened to fall off the train was no big loss. And, you know, it's just littered with them here. So they were probably just loading them up from these supply platforms onto flatbed cars, falling off. And hey, that's just another leather shoe. When you think of just the comparison of that, and the irony behind all that is that the Confederates would have just lived to have maybe just a pair of those shoes. But I just think it's a wonderful photograph. This is what it looks like today. Now, this one is another wartime map. It shows the wharf. And if you look at the Tennessee River where it says Tennessee, to the left, you'll see a building that says Depot. That is the double roof supply warehouse. And you see in front of it says Wharf. This is a photo this is one of those Coonley photos that he took of that warehouse. You see the men, you see the officers. You see a guy it looks like a couple of guys up front in overcoats. But this was the length of a football field. And this is a double roofed, shake roofed warehouse. I can't imagine. I mean, look at the shakes on that, what it took to build that board and batten warehouse. But it was a massive structure. And this will play a key role in the battle. You also look out front. I'm a railroad fanatic. So if you look out front, you see the double tracks in the front. If you'll look carefully, you see a void underneath the railroad tracks. That is a chute that was a pulley system that allowed the supplies. It went all the way through the building, underneath the building. So when the transport boats unloaded the supplies on the wharf in front of this building, that pulley system pulled the supplies up into the warehouse, and eventually they were able to be loaded up, brought out through the warehouse. And you can't see it if it's off frame, but the engine was in another building that ran the belt out here to the left of the railroad. Right underneath that roof, you see stacks of wheelbarrows. And I enhanced that photo so much that if you look in the deep, dark areas of that photograph, you see stacks and stacks of blankets. And I've often wondered if that blanket that I showed you earlier that was an artifact was one of those blankets stacked up there. Probably was. This is what that location looks like today. So when you're at the park, you have this beautiful view of the Tennessee River. And that was from an event that we had. We had some reenactors there that had brought in, those are both 3-inch ordnance rifles, to do some living history activities. But that is the location where the double roof warehouse was located. If you'll look at the word today, the original Tennessee River channel, if you look just where the T is on the word today, that is what is remaining of the western riverbank and the Civil War. So that darker water from there out to the edge of that colorful floral area is the original 60-foot channel of the Tennessee River. So that warehouse would have been built in the foreground where that very shallow water is. When you get past the muddy, shallow water, it drops off dramatically to the 60-foot depth right there. This is number 4. It shows the great sawmill inside of the depot. That's the long building directly in the middle. But what's so utilitarian about this photo, look at all the smoke from the wood fires. You know, this is the era of wood-fired heat. So you're seeing the results of that. You're seeing steam engines, you're seeing smoke fires, and it just basically covers the entire depot. But what's so important about this, other than the railroad trestle, is you barely see a single tree standing because all those resources were cut down, sawed up into board lumber, there's an enhancement of that building. This is what I was telling you a while ago. If you'll look closely to the right, you'll see a 4-horse wagon. You'll see a gentleman sitting on top of that. But more importantly, look at the sawmill building in the middle. And if you look off to the left, you see a man there. It looks like he's receiving a board coming through the sawmill. This sawmill was responsible for cutting over 400 board length pieces of lumber, 400,000 square board feet of lumber that was used to build all the buildings in the depot and probably a lot of the railroad ties that were used to construct the Johnsonville Northwestern Railroad. There's another enhancement. Along with that, a lot of the soldiers recall how muddy and nasty it was and the hordes of mosquitoes. You can see how the water just sat there. Can you imagine what that would have been like in the summer months? And you understand why the soldiers were writing about the horrific mosquitoes that probably spawned out of the sitting water. This is what that area looks like today. I thought I'd include a winter shot. It sits a little bit further back, but what you're looking at right there is if you look at that railroad trestle in the middle and go back to where you see the tree, in that vicinity of the tree is this location right there. That's what you would see today. And I wanted to use a winter shot because it shows you the landscape without the leaves and you can really see the landscape. And of course, number 5 is the most iconic photo. All of you have seen this. It's just an incredibly, the way that it's formatted, the way that he uses the camera to capture that triangular shape. Off to the left, you see the Tennessee River. In the background is Trace Creek. And of course, the ramp that he was standing on earlier that I showed you shows the loading ramp. This is such an important photo because it also shows Western Theater United States colored troops wearing overcoats. You've seen United States colored troops in many photographs in the Eastern Theater, but this is other than the Nashville photos taken in the winter of 1864 by Bernard, I have not seen, unless they are existing outside of a book, a photograph of Union soldiers in overcoats, Black Union soldiers in the Western Theater. This is one of the only photos that exists that shows that. You do see a Mcclellan saddle sitting off there to the left. And what I love about this photo, and it was one of those that I mentioned that you can really zoom in on, if you look at the officer directly in the center with the unlimbered caissons in the back and the cannon, the tacks thrown up on top of it, that is a white officer. So if you've seen the movie Glory, this is what's going on, just like that. You have Black troops serving in the rear, mainly as quartermaster or in some position of labor, being officered by white officers. And that gentleman right there is a lieutenant. You could focus in on his face so well. And again, I challenge you to if you go to the Library of Congress and you pull up Coonley's photographs, scroll in, you can see the detail on all these men. You can see the buttons on that guy's uniform. It's amazing. But that is truly the iconic photo. When you've heard of Johnsonville, Tennessee in your past research or history, you've seen this photograph. You see the soldiers' barracks associated in the background. We're gonna have to scoot along here. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit behind. If you go there today, this is what you see. It's like 156 years later. You still see the railroad just going right out into the water. It's like they just closed the depot and walked away from it. So if you just walk down on the riverfront, the railroad is still there. This is that view from the corral shot that I just showed you, looking across the river. That high knob is Pilot Knob across the river. That's another state park. It's called Nathan Bedford Forrest State Park. And just underneath the brow of that hill is where one of the Union gunboats was burned during the expedition. This is an aerial photo taken in 1937. This had not been seen before either. This was a TVA photograph that photographed, they were taking pictures of the towns in the Tennessee River Valley before the flooding that made Kentucky Lake. But this shows you the levee across the river where the Confederates would eventually set up to bombard Johnsonville. And it gives you a really good scale And you see the exact railroad being used. This is in 1937. So what are we talking? We got almost 75 years later. The railroad's still being used that was built by the military, the spurs that are going off to the right. The town of Johnsonville there is in the foreground. Of course, it grew after the war. There was a Union blockhouse at Johnsonville that probably looked like this. This is the location of where it was situated. The trail that you see just below the tree line there is the railroad bed. And that would eventually lead to this. That is the turntable. And what a turntable looked like in the Civil War, it was an open air structure. Some of those were enclosed, but most of them were open air. And that's a model of one. That's what it would look like. So when the trains came in, you see the engine off to the left, it would pull onto this turntable. And by the use of usually horsepower or pockets where men use long poles to turn this arm, it would turn the engine back around in the direction of Nashville. And then there would be a secondary engine that was permanently located at the depot that would back down to the warehouses, load the cars up with supplies. It was called a switch engine. And the switch engine would pull the cars back up the track after this engine had been serviced and turned around, and it would return in the direction of Nashville. So later on, they developed things called roundhouses where engines would pull in and then the roundhouse was a mechanical device that would do it. But in these days, they were still by hand, mechanically, manually turning these engines around. And that's what it would have looked like. That's what's left of it today when you go to Johnsonville. So I'll just very quickly go through the Union forces here. William Sherman, of course, his army is operating in Georgia, but the Army of the Cumberland being commanded by Major General George Thomas, he is the general that's in charge in Nashville, whose supply operation is dependent upon the supplies coming into Johnsonville. At Johnsonville in command is this young man, 24-year-old colonel. His name was Charles Thompson. He was also the commander of the 12th USCT. He was a resident of Maine, and he joins the Army at a young age, gets promoted through the ranks. He actually joined as a private, so by 1864, he's promoted to a colonel. And like I mentioned the movie Glory a while ago, it's almost identical to that story. Matthew Broderick, who plays Shaw, is 23 years old. He's given the rank of a colonel to be in charge of a Negro regiment that becomes the 54th Massachusetts. The same thing is going on here. 24-year-old Charles Thompson is given command of the 12th USCT, and he comes to Johnsonville with his regiment in charge of those men, and eventually finds himself almost mistakenly in charge of the whole depot. There's also a naval commander at Johnsonville. His name is Acting Volunteer Lieutenant Edward King. So it's a convoluted mess, is what I'm trying to tell you. You have a Union commander that's in charge, a colonel that's in charge of the Army. You also have a naval officer that's in charge of the naval forces. And how do you think those guys got along? Not very well at all. They actually hate each other's guts. And it's very apparent when the battle takes place. But King and Thompson share this command responsibility of the supply base at Johnsonville. Here's what makes up the Johnsonville garrison. About a force of 2,200 men, 700 Wisconsin infantry. You had a combination of USCT troops that equaled around 500 to 600 men. The quartermaster's department, which were civilians, really outnumbered the soldiers. There was 800 of those civilians working there. And by the way, this would be the first time that U.S. Department of Quartermaster's Department civilians would be armed in defense of a Union supply depot. It worked so well that eventually when Hood would decide to attack Nashville a month later, Donelson would do the same thing in Nashville and arm civilians to go out into the trenches and with the soldiers hold the line to try to protect the outer defenses of Nashville. That's going on first here at Johnsonville. You also have the 11th and 2nd Tennessee, the famed 1st Kansas Battery, the 2nd U.S. Colored Light Artillery, and of course the U.S. Quartermaster's Department also had artillery. So you had a force that in this battle is actually going to be outnumbered by the Confederates. This is one of the, I use this in the book actually. This is a photograph of an ancestor that had a member in the 43rd Wisconsin. He was called Ralph Bushnell. So you can see, this, I mean, think about this. The 4-button sack coats were in such high demand, being mass produced. Those were being sent on trains to Sherman's army operating in Georgia. So you had this backstock of these outdated frock coats that the soldiers started the war with that were still available. So these later regiments, especially the Iowa and the Wisconsin troops that are mustered in the service, like the 43rd, beginning in August and September of 1864, are being issued these early 1861 frock coats, and they come to Johnsonville wearing these frock coats. So here you are, you're late in the war with men that are outfitted in frock coats. And I found that, I did see, we do have some photos of some of the 43rd wearing sack coats, but in looking at a lot of the requisitions and some of the quartermaster clothing requisitions, I did see quite a few of these frock coats being issued. These are the officers, the gentlemen of most importance that's sitting in the chair in dead center. That is, excuse me, I drew a blank. I'll think of it in a minute. 5th Wisconsin commander of, he was the commander of the 43rd Wisconsin. His name escapes me at the moment, I'm sorry. Lorenzo Atwood basically changed the route of my book. I'll just tell you this quick story. One day, his ancestor showed up in the park as I was working one day, and he rolled his window down and said, hey, I had an ancestor here that was at Johnsonville. And that was a regular thing. Like if you work at these Civil War battlefields, you have people coming all the time wanting to see the place where their ancestor fought. And in that same sentence, he goes, and I also have all of his letters that he wrote from Johnsonville to his wife, Cordelia. And of course, as a student, right in the middle of writing my dissertation, that red light just exploded out of my head. And this is what we thirst for, that primary source, never before seen research, especially letters of the actual participants that wrote from the place that you're writing about. So this changed the whole dynamics of the book. And I now had a first-hand account of what the interior workings look like inside of Johnsonville. So all the stories of Johnsonville that I alluded to at the beginning of the program that had been pickled through Confederate Veteran Magazine that were always told from the Confederate perspective, we knew really nothing about what the interior, other than Coonley's photographs, was going on inside of Johnsonville until Atwood's letters showed up. And he, I got to know the ancestor very well. We're good friends to this day. And he let me use his letters as the basis of my research. So the Atwood letters basically changed everything. And what I'm going to show you next is just one of those jewels that showed up in those letters, which was this. He actually had a hand-drawn map of the interior of the depot. We had no idea that this existed. We didn't even know what it looked like. But here, he actually, you can see right underneath there, he writes, you'll see it, it says barracks. There's 11 of those barracks, and it's extraordinary detail. It doesn't really, they're not laid out in military fashion as you would see Company A, B, C. It's mixed up. You see Company A, D, H, J, E, F. You see a smaller building in the middle of that line. But what's very particular about this, he makes a side note. He writes off to the side, number 1, he says that is a battery of guns, which matches up with Coonley's photograph. Number 2, he says is a regiment of cavalry. That also matches up with Coonley's photograph. And number 3, it says, the note says Company B of our regiment on a high hill 100 rods. He's a little off scale there, but that also shows you the fort that I showed you earlier with the man in the poncho standing on top of the wall. And then he takes a line, and you can see what he writes there: picket line 5 miles in extent. So he's showing the picket line that's still out there today. All those earthworks just run through the middle of the woods, and they're immaculately preserved. So we have a visual aid of Johnsonville, and you can see the date at the very top. He wrote that on really close to this date, October 19th, 1864, and it's a letter to his wife. And we have this transcribed, and he goes into tremendous detail, talking about the food, talking about not getting enough sleep, talking about his bunk mate and the food there, everything that soldiers talk about. We actually took some of those descriptions that he used to describe the huts when I was manager there, and we actually reconstructed some of the Garrison huts to conduct our living history program at the park. So we took an actual account of a 9x9 board and batten soldier's hut, save, instead we did do shingle roofs. He does say they had white canvas tarps, but they had masonry chimneys with bunk beds on one side and a fireplace on the other. And through volunteers and through work of staff, we constructed 4 of these to replicate that. And they're one of the signature sites that you see today when you visit the park. This is one of the USCT members. The 12th, 13th, 40th, 41st, and 100 made up the USCT regiments that were at Johnsonville to guard the depot. We also had the U.S. Colored Light Artillery. This is MiG section of Battery A. That's a photograph taken in Nashville of the battery. I'm sorry, it's a little fuzzy. It took a lot for me to get this, but and I was sorry after I finally saw it, but I was able to get at the Kansas Historical Society a photograph of their flag that was at Johnsonville, and I was really hoping they would have a Johnsonville battle recognition on there, but it does say Nashville at the bottom, but it was not, because they played such an important role in this battle. But that is the famed battle flag of the 1st Kansas Battery. Some of the U.S. Naval personnel that was at Johnsonville, you had approximately 400 men. You also had 4 tin-clads that were owned by the United States Navy, and very quickly you had converted transport boats that were civilian-owned that were used to haul supplies. But you also had converted steamers that had originally, before the war, been civilian packet boats that had been bought by the United States Navy and transferred into what was called a tin-clad, which was just basically almost like an aluminum can nailed on the outside of these wooden boats. And they were armed usually with 24-pound howitzers. So these are the tin-clads that would participate in the Battle of Johnsonville. You also had about 20 civilian transport boats and barges. This is another drawing by David. It shows you a side view of what the boats look like. So you have the Tarwa at the top, the Undyne that's eventually captured, the USS Elfin, and the USS Key West. Remnants of those boats, 3 of those boats, sit at the base of Johnsonville today in about 15 feet of water. Johnsonville, by the way, is also one of the only Civil War battle sites on an inland river that has boat wrecks that are still intact, and they're there. So it gives you an idea of the footprint of what they look like. Well, doesn't that picture tell a million stories? Shows you how young this guy was. This is a Western Theater sailor. I couldn't believe when I found this. But this is taken in 1862, I believe, of a sailor of probably around Cairo, Mound City, Illinois. So he was operating on the Brownwater Navy, which would have been the Navy operating on the Tennessee River at this time. Now, I'll get into the Johnsonville expedition. I know I'm running a little bit late, so we'll get through this. Are we okay, Laura, with where I'm at? So Nathan Bedford Forrest, of course, he's in charge of this campaign that begins in October, and it kicks off. I'll just quickly run through this because it's very complicated and we don't have the time to get into all the details, but I do want to give you the cliff notes of what happened. So on the 16th of October, Forrest is ordered by his commander, Richard Taylor, to make a raid into West Tennessee to basically harass and destroy Union operations on the Tennessee River. So you see Forrest's orders right there. Sever Sherman's communications, delay George Thomas at Nashville from concentrating troops, and assist John Bell Hood's advance in the Middle Tennessee. That's his main goal of the campaign. His division leaders was General James Chalmers with his 1st Division. And within Chalmers' division, he had 2 brigade commanders that play a very important role in this, Colonel Thomas Mabry and Colonel Robert McClellan. And these gentlemen really came through during this campaign as a part of Chalmers' division. He also had Colonel Edmund Rucker and Lieutenant Colonel David Kelly, who operated in conjunction with Chalmers. You got to remember, at this time, you had infantry and you also had mounted infantry. So you had men serving as actual cavalry troopers, but you also had infantrymen that had been mounted, and you also had foot infantry as well. Forrest's 2nd Division was under the command of Brigadier General Abraham Buford. His subordinates were General Highland Lyon and Colonel Tyree Bell. If you have not had a chance to read the book that came out a few years ago on Tyree Bell, I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic read, and he goes into some of the detail during the Johnsonville campaign. His very youthful 24-year-old chief of artillery is Captain John W. Morton. Morton is attached to Buford's 2nd Division and would accompany Lyon's brigade on this very day, October 28th, as they moved north into Kentucky to capture and begin this campaign at a place called Fort Hindman that's set almost directly across the river from Fort Henry, Tennessee. This is what it looks like today. I took that photograph, I think about 2015. The National Park Service owns it today. It's a subsidiary of Fort Donelson National Battlefield. And we do know that these are earthworks that were occupied by Buford's men when they arrived there in October of 1864. This gives you a better idea today of what the Kentucky Lake looks like. You see the channel in the middle of the map. So you see the original Tennessee River channel, and you see what the Kentucky Lake has done. I mean, it expanded the boundaries that much, but I'm showing this because if you look at the line at the top, the red line, that's the bridge that crosses the river today. Right around that corner, just to the tip of the left, is Fort Hindman. It's at the very top of the map. And as you come down in the middle, you'll see there where it says Tennessee National Migratory Wildlife Refuge. If you look to the left of that, it says Big Sandy River. And the Big Sandy River emptied out into the Tennessee River Channel about in the middle of the map. That's going to play a significant role at the start of this campaign. So Forrest eventually ended up capturing a number of boats, positioning artillery at Paris Landing, Tennessee, and at Fort Hindman. One of those boats is the USS Undyne, as I described earlier. You saw I've never been able to locate a photograph of the Undyne, but this is its sister ship called the USS Nymph, and it's gunboat number 54. The USS Undyne was gunboat number 55. So we're pretty certain that this is what it looked like. But this is a common tin clad. You see the chambers at the top where the men that were basically turned into were a barracks area where they could sleep. And then you have the gun ports that you see almost at the bottom. You see how shallow drafted that is, how close to the water line they actually take. These are some of the vessels that were seized by Forrest's troops beginning on October 28th. The Mazeppa, the Venus is eventually captured, the Undyne, and the Cheeseman. The Cheeseman was actually attacked. The Confederates bombard this vessel with artillery. It's deemed unusable, and they actually burn it at the mouth of the Big Sandy River. In the 1970s, they did an underwater archaeological dive on that boat and uncovered the capstan to that boat that we have that's still at Johnsonville State Park, along with a number of artifacts that came off that boat. The Mazeppa, of course, was burned, as well as the Venus and the Undyne. So we have a pretty good idea where the Undyne is located today, but we thought in the year 2010 they may have salvaged some parts of what some underwater divers thought they had found, but it turned out to be a 1920s era barge that had been sunk in that location. So just prior to the Battle of Johnsonville, there's another naval battle that really was forgotten. And, you know, you read about the naval battle at Fort Donelson and how engaging that was with the poop turtles and all the ironclads that came up the Cumberland River and attacked from the water Fort Donelson. Well, you have a similar thing happening here the day before and the day of the Battle of Johnsonville on November the 4th. The day before, on November the 3rd, you had a number of gunboat engagements. After the Confederates occupy the Undyne, they use that floating downriver to attack Johnsonville. So you have Confederate troops boarding captured Union vessels, and those two vessels ended up being the Venus and the Undyne. And in conjunction with land troops, with Buford and Chalmers' men accompanying the land boats by land, they basically make the 40-mile trip from Paris Landing, beginning on November the 1st, to the vicinity of Johnsonville. As they get closer to Johnsonville, they begin to encounter Union patrols, Union gunboat patrols. And one of those patrols they encounter is the USS Key West. And you can see that written. This is a map. This is a period map that Commander Leroy Fitch drew in 1864, shortly after the battle. And it's pretty good. It shows Reynoldsburg Island that you see in the middle. That area you see where the channel that's indicated by the dots is the only way you could get around a dry bar that was shoal. This was known by all the Western River pilots as the chute. And it was very shallow in there, but it was the only way to get through there. The Confederates knew about this, and you see that's why they planted their batteries in the area called the chute, and really gave a shellacking to some of those Union gunboats that came up that day to try to encounter the two captured boats. And in a very heated engagement, which becomes known as the Battle of Reynoldsburg Island, eventually what happens is the captured Undyne withdraws from the battle. The Key West suffers a number of damages from the land-bound batteries under Captain Morton's battery, and they retreat back to Johnsonville to continue repairs the night of. So you have this naval battle called the Battle of Reynoldsburg Island that takes place the day before. The Key West found this photo. This is an amazing shot. The Key West is the boat to the far left. You can see the tin clad. Not quite sure what the other boats in line. These could be some of the other Johnsonville boats, but we do know identified by the number 55 on top of that. Excuse me, number 52 is the USS Key West. So it all unfolds at 2:00 p.m. on the afternoon of November the 4th. Johnsonville, the Battle of Johnsonville is, as I mentioned, it's one of these, tactically for the Confederates, it was very important. Strategically, though, you have to remember at this time, the Confederacy is losing the war and they're losing badly. So all of a sudden, you have Nathan Bedford Forrest pop up on the opposite side of the river of this very important Union supply depot, and at 5 cannon positions that were very strategically placed overnight as they worked their way down, constructing gun chambers. And you see an image here. It's not the best drawing, but it does show you kind of what it would have looked like. You see the depot off in the distance, 370 yards away, and concealing themselves in the natural levee of the river. They cut these gun embrasures into the levee, stick the muzzles of the cannon through there, camouflaging around it, and they sink the trails of the guns, the trails being the end of it, back into these chambers to get the elevation. So they do that, and they succeed in basically zeroing in right on the wharf. And at 2:00 in the afternoon on November the 4th, they unleash all holy hell upon Johnsonville Supply Depot. Now, there's a lot of accounts that I won't get into because you read more about it in the book. But for years, you heard that the Confederates conducted a surprise attack on the Union Depot, and they were completely surprised. I refuted that in my research because I found Union correspondence that totally goes against that. They said that we were very aware that the gunners were over there, that they were sighted, and that they sent patrols out into the river. And they said that they got within 50 yards of the bank, and where we've always heard that the Confederates actually started the battle and commenced fire, right, synchronizing their watches all together from 5 gun positions at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The Union correspondence refutes that, and they says, well, no, that's not what happened at all. We actually fired the first shot. So there's still speculation there about how the battle unfolded. But regardless, it does take place around 2 p.m. in the afternoon. This was one of the muddiest, rainiest seasons of the entire Civil War. The Confederates had trekked 40 miles. It took them 4 days to get from those 40 miles through these unpassable roads. They hand carried these guns into position to get them in place. It was one of the hardest campaigns that Nathan Bedford Forrest and Morton write about in their memoirs after the war, and talk about how just impossible it was to plant these guns. But this unfolds on November the 4th. Here's some of the guns that were used. They had Rodmans, 3-inch Rodmans, 12-pound howitzers. There were actually 2 James rifles there and 2 10-pound Parrott rifles, all strategically placed to attack the depot. Once again, there's Fort Johnson on top of the hill. Once the battle begins, you actually can see the embrasures where some of the gun ports were cut into. They immediately returned fire from the forts. And what Forrest was most worried about were the gunboats that were docked at the wharf, because he knew he'd been under fire at Shiloh by the Lexington and Tyler gunboats. And he knew that if they would have backed out and broadsided that riverbank, they would have been destroyed. And that leads me into something I didn't want to get into because we're running out of time. But Forrest and Morton got into an argument earlier prior to planting the guns about whether or not it was the best bet, safest bet, to actually occupy the position they did, because Forrest knew that if those guns were brought upon them, they would have approximately 50 24-pound Dahlgren Seacoast artillery guns barreling down on them, and they would have been trapped and destroyed in the bottoms of the Tennessee River. So there would have been no Selma, Alabama. There would have been no Nashville, Tennessee. Forrest's force would have been destroyed in the bottoms, in those river bottoms. I had a Confederate ancestor that was there, and I think about that. I think about what they were going through at hand carrying those guns into place, and what those Union defenders were thinking across the river as they were firing back. And that's one of the reasons why Forrest writes in his memoirs after the war. He says the firing was so terrific, unlike anything that I'd ever heard in the war. And he was at Shiloh. So this is a big battle. I mean, there's a lot of artillery. This is an artillery battle. There's very, very few casualties that take place in this, because you didn't have troops, unlike places like Gettysburg and Fredericksburg, where they were opposing each other very closely on an open field, fighting right amongst each other. So you're fighting across a 300-foot span, but the Battle of Johnsonville is primarily an artillery battle, and it's a massive artillery battle. I read in some accounts that over 1,500 rounds were engaged, 1,500 to 2,000 rounds were fired during the battle, and that's a lot of ordnance. That's a lot of artillery. And you got to think, this went on for 2 days. It didn't stop on the 4th. It carried on into the next day. This does show you the lower redoubt, how it looks today. There's still continued restoration that's going on. Some of the dangerous trees we removed to protect the berms. This is just a Parrott rifle. This is used by Confederates as well as Union gunners. Pure chaos. So the battle on the 4th lasts approximately till dark. And you got to remember, in those days, there's no daylight savings time. Daylight savings time didn't exist. So it got dark at 5 o'clock. So at dark, much of the fighting ceases. Now, the Confederates that night pull out, but only after burning one of the main warehouse buildings to the ground and most of the stores that they had stockpiled on the wharf out in front of warehouse number 1. They tried to set fire to warehouse number 2, but did not succeed. But they did just a chaotic job of bombarding the depot. There's numerous accounts that you'll read in the book of those shells landing in the horse corral, causing massive panic from horses just splitting off through the middle of the depot. Civilians skimming up the hill to try to seek refuge in the fort. Civilians in the town trying to run into the town to take refuge inside the buildings, getting bombarded. It is absolutely, as I say here, it was pure chaos, all taking place from these concealed artillery positions across the river. And you have to remember one thing, and again, you'll read about this, but Thompson never considered that the fort would be attacked from across the river. He had intelligence that Forrest was working in the vicinity, so he was scared to death, just like most of the Union officers that were in charge of outposts, that another Fort Pillow may happen. Where Forrest came in, he surrounds the fort, demanded unconditional surrender, and they take it by force. Thompson was scared to death of this, and that's why they reinforced the outside perimeter, just like the rifle pit that I showed you in Atwood's drawing. So at some point during the battle, the U.S. commanders, fearing that this flank maneuver is going to take place, lose their nerve, and they go down to the wharf, and Thompson orders Howland and some of the other officers to begin taking torches and setting fire to the transport boats and all of the gunboats. In all, 26 vessels are burnt to the ground at the wharf that day. The winds are up. It sweeps across the wharf 600 yards wide and burns the entire shebang to the ground. Now, somehow warehouse number 2 did survive, including a lot of the loading ramps on the inner part of the depot and many of the buildings. But I'd say a third of the front area of the depot was destroyed during the battle. So it's a significant loss to the Union supply efforts. That night, as I mentioned, the Confederates withdraw back down to Perryville, Tennessee. Forrest leaves behind remnants of Briggs' section of Rice's battery and Rucker's infantry. They continue the battle at 7 a.m. the next morning, and they continue using artillery fire upon the town and small arms fire all day long. There's one great little account that you'll read in the book where USCT soldiers ran to the bank with Enfield rifles, and they begin firing back at the Confederates. And Rucker's brigade talks about killing a number of these United States colored troops on the bank of the river. And I've often tried to gather who the casualties actually were of the 11 people that the Union reported being killed. And I've often wondered if it was truly these USCT soldiers, and I think it was. So the last shots of the Battle of Johnsonville are fired around 7 p.m. on the evening of Saturday, November the 5th. Here's what the river looks like today. I mentioned to you those gunboat wrecks are still in the river. If you'll look out to the tip of where you see those rocks, those wrecks, we think, and there have been dives down there to locate. They're using underwater magnetometers, X-rays. They were able to imprint what appears to be probably the USS Elfin and the USS Tarawa and 2 barges. They're in around 15 to 20 feet of water, sitting right on the edge of the wharf. That's what it looks like today. So the Union losses at Johnsonville, you have, look at this, 4 gunboats, 14 transports, 17 barges, 33 pieces of artillery. Quartermaster stores burns with 75,000 to 120,000 tons of supplies. If you don't think this is Forrest's greatest raid of the war, then I don't know of another one. And then 150 Union prisoners, and those prisoners were taken earlier in the campaign when they captured the USS Cheeseman, the transport Cheeseman and the Mazeppa. 8 to 11 men killed during the battle. I think it was a little bit more than that, but total losses estimated, and these are of course estimates that were estimated by the Union defenders at around $6.7 million. Confederate losses were very, very shallow. 2 men killed, and the 2 men killed were killed by a limb that hung out above one of the Confederate artillery positions, and that limb fell across the cannon and broke the necks of the 2 gunners. And there was 9 men supposedly that Chalmers and Forrest put together as in their final report as far as wounded men. The very next day, remnants of Schofield's division, this is the famed John Schofield from the Battle of Franklin, he sends 2 brigades there, his 1st and 2nd Brigade, and they begin reinforcing the place with about 2,200 reinforcement troops, and begin also enhancing some of the entrenchments, such as the upper redoubt, and cutting down the trees across the river where Forrest had built his chambers. So after the battle, they immediately cut down all the trees so they have a view of any kind of activity that might take place. See, they still think the Forrest is in the area, and he had already withdrawn way south down to Perryville, Tennessee that night, and eventually they end up back in Corinth, Mississippi. This is what the upper redoubt looks like today. And again, if you haven't been to Johnsonville, other than Triune, Tennessee, these are some of the most well-preserved earthworks that, and I've worked in Virginia and have lived in the Western Theater most of my life. And these are some of the most immaculately preserved. They've never had any work done to them. A lot of the national battlefield parks like Fort Donelson in the 1930s, when the CCC was in there, they were adding dirt on top of those earthworks to make them larger. These have never been touched. They've just set out in the woods under a canopy for years, being protected by direct rainfall, and that's exactly what you see today, just immaculate. So on November 26, what happens at Johnsonville, General Thomas orders the depot to be abandoned with all of its stores and machinery and all of its personnel sent to Nashville. And on the 30th, the last train finally leaves Nashville, and they move everything to Nashville because Hood has moved into Tennessee. They fight the Great Battle of Franklin, and they begin to move on, as you know, that story, which is another story, on to attack Nashville beginning on December the 2nd. So the results of this battle, just to wrap it up here, it was a tactical victory for the Confederates. Strategically, Forrest's victory had little effect against Sherman's massive war machine moving rapidly at this time through Georgia. 1/3 of Johnsonville Supply Depot was destroyed on November the 4th. Aftermath, the Confederates' 2-week-long campaign not only resulted in the near complete destruction of Johnsonville, but it rendered the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad useless. Because when they abandoned that, after a year of building this, the Union Army really had no more use of that. They did send a contingent of USCT troops back down to Johnsonville in January of 1865, and they remained there until the war's end. And of course, the loss of Johnsonville supply base left Thomas and Nashville doubtful of the future use of the Tennessee River as a supply base. And as a result of this, you all know the story, Sherman's famous march to the sea. That's where he made his quote, "As the rebels have destroyed our base of supplies," and he's talking about Johnsonville, "they," meaning the rebel citizens, "must furnish our subsistence. You will bear the brunt of the after effects." And you know that story, Sherman's fiery march through Georgia. So that's in a very quick retelling of that story, and I hope in the book you'll find a lot of details that I wasn't not able to get into tonight. And Laura, I know we're a little bit over time, but I'll be more than glad to open up to questions at this point. I've got some post-Civil War stuff, but I don't think we have time to get into that.
Great. Well, they've already
I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that anybody may have.
Yeah, they've already said that they want you back for round 2, so they've already entered in the chat box that they want you to come back for round 2. So
I'm sorry, I had your volume. Say that again one more time.
said they've already said that they want you to come back for round 2.
Maybe do the post Johnsonville. What happens after the war? Who knows?
Right.
We might be able to build it into Civil War talk somehow.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna get to those questions in just a minute. Before we do that, we are going to introduce Mike Kendra, who is the owner of Civil War Talk, to tell us about how to become a member in case you're not already one. And Jerry, I know you're already a member, but maybe there's some folks who aren't.
Hi, everybody. It's Mike here from Civil War Talk, and wanted to just invite everybody to visit Civil War Talk. We have a great forum, and I want to thank Mr. Wooten for visiting with us tonight. His presentation was wonderful. There's a lot of great American history that we all learned. And I think we all had a great time listening to all the different things about Johnsonville, because I think there's a lot of things that all of us learned. I had no idea about a lot of the things that we learned tonight. So it was a pretty good program. But definitely wanted to invite everybody to come visit us over at Civil War Talk, because we're going to have probably a copy of obviously our chat, and we'll be able to take additional questions and have some discussion. And well, there's all kinds of different discussions on Civil War Talk in addition to Johnsonville discussions. And we're actually opening up some new sections. We have a resources area we just opened where we can share new books. Like we'll make sure that this book gets featured in the resources area between tonight and tomorrow. So that'll be available on there too. And I'm sure Laura will have a whole bunch of information about where you can get that book shortly. But just so you know a little bit more about Civil War Talk, we have programs that we try to run every week on Wednesday nights. And we also go ahead and have all different other events that we do monthly and weekly, like trivia contests. And we have lots of fans and historians and reenactors on our website. And we really love the Civil War era. It's our passion. So we want you to come visit us. We've been around since 1999. And our website's totally free for new members. It always has been. And we'd love to have you come and visit us. And if you want to support us, we have a premium membership option that you can go ahead and check out. So come visit us at Civil War Talk. We'd really love to see you, and come join our community today. Oop.
Sorry,
Laura might be muted.
Yeah, sorry about that, Jerry. I muted you. I'm sorry.
Oh,
You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike. That's I hope everybody will join today and become a member. And Jerry has agreed to answer some of these questions over on the forum at Civil War Talk, but he's also going to answer some right here tonight. So we're going to get to those questions now, and let's see what we have first, Jerry. Let's see. The first question is about the sources that you found when you were looking for sources for your research. And Paul would like to know, were you surprised that most of the primary sources leaned Confederate? That he asked that question before you got to the information about the letters. And he also said it, especially considering how vital Johnsonville was to the Union Army.
Okay. Surprisingly, since I was I was digging into both Union and Confederate sources for the book, there were many more Union primary sources that I uncovered, primarily because of the railroad construction, and there were questions that had been answered, as I mentioned, from Confederate Veteran magazine by actual Confederates at the turn of the century that I already had that were direct accounts. But what I didn't have were those questions that I needed to ask about why the place existed, how it was built. So that required me trying to locate Union correspondence to answer those questions. I had enough background and research that I had done years even prior to starting the Johnsonville story on Chalmers and especially Buford. And I'd been a fan of John Morton since I was a child. And I had a lot of that material collected already, but what I did not have were the Union anecdotes and the accounts. So that was a big part of my research, was trying to locate. And I did that really all over the country. I visited the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Tennessee State Archives was wonderful, University of Wisconsin, and I spent time in Wisconsin because of the Wisconsin troops that were there. A lot of the USCT research did come out of the Tennessee State Library and Archives locally, so I was able to find a lot of the information about the impressed laborers here as well. But I hope I answered your question. What was the second part of that, Laura?
Just mainly, were you surprised that most of the sources were leaned Confederate, and especially considering how vital it was to the Union. So yeah, I think he did. And then Paul also said, thanks, the book reads really well. So he's already read it and recommends it to everyone. Gerald would like to know, does a railroad still go through Johnsonville?
It does. CSX owns the railroad. They own practically any railroad I've seen in Tennessee. And it doesn't go through the old town of Johnsonville. As you're leaving Waverly, it now goes, basically, it has to go up a hill, and it goes through the town of New Johnsonville that I mentioned earlier. In 1944, Johnsonville was flooded by the TVA to create the reservoir. And in doing so, they had to relocate the railroad track. So when you go to Johnsonville, you'll see you go up a huge hill, and it is a big hill to get to the top of what is the new town of Johnsonville, called New Johnsonville. But the railroad that was constructed to get there, up until you get to that point, is still the same railroad bed that was constructed in 1863 and 1864 that's been enhanced by the modern railroad. So you're actually, when you're driving on Highway 70, the oldest highway in Tennessee, Highway 70 and 79, as you're traversing that highway, that railroad on your right side is this exact same route that they used to build the Nashville Northwestern Railroad in 1864. So you're traversing that on the highway. So that's an excellent question.
Wow, that was a great question. We're kind of short on time, so I'm just going to pick a few of these questions out, and you'll answer the rest maybe in the forum. I know you're a member.
Absolutely. Yes.
If you make copies the transcript from the chat log, we can post those in the post where we advertised your program tonight, and then you can just answer them there. And even the ones you've already answered would be great to go ahead and answer them in case somebody missed the answers. So for the last question, I'm going to use Ray's question, and he said he would like to know, he said that a big feature of the book was the transition from enslaved to self-liberated laborer to soldier to free man experienced by the members of the USCT is part of the central narrative of the book. And is there an individual that exemplifies that transformation for you that's included in the book?
You know, there is. Let me just real quick. Let me read you something. There were so many, but one particularly. So a lot of thank you for asking that question. A lot of the USCT, you got to remember. So the war ends. They're Union soldiers. They're at this depot in the middle of Tennessee wilderness, and where do they go? That's the big question around the country. They're free black men. Many of them are married. They get married after the war, and they stay in Johnsonville, and they start families there. So what's fascinating is that the first population of Johnsonville is from these USCT soldiers that stayed there right after the war and basically set up the town. So one of those in particular that I wanted to mention was a Private Dempsey Green in Company A and a George Overall who was in Company C. Both of these guys were members of the 13th USCT who, if you recall, after the Battle of Nashville, I mentioned they were sent back there. So in June, they're mustered out of service. And it's the big question. It's like, what do we do now? And they stayed there and they built houses and they created farms and built a church. And as the town of Johnsonville grew, and it's in the South and segregation followed shortly after, you had developed what became the black side of town and you had the white side of town. And in that black African-American side of town, you had a number of these USCT veterans that were living there. And they were living on the pension that they received after the war as serving the Union. So most of those men were able to survive much better than those impressed laborers that were impressed out of those counties around Nashville because they had that government pension to be able to buy land and start to farm around there. So, and I list a number more of those men in there. TSLA, the Tennessee State Library and Archives, just had muster rolls of these men, and it showed where they ended up after the war. And there was a good number of those that came back and started farms and families at Johnsonville. Good. That's a great question.
Yeah, great. Maybe you can provide some of that, some more examples in the comments on the forum, because I know everybody, there were several questions about the impressed laborers, the USCT, and the transformation of their lives. So if you can add some of that information there, that'd be great. And the rest, it looks like a lot of people saying thank you so much and please bring you back for round 2. So I think we're going to have to try to get you lined up for another date.
Absolutely. I apologize for going over. I got too excited about the subject, I guess.
It's okay. It's great. So we'll get Jerry to answer the rest of the questions at the forum at CivilWarTalk.com. So go to where you found the promotion for this event there on the forum. And this is Jerry's book, Johnsonville Union Supply Operations on the Tennessee River and the Battle of Johnsonville, November 4th to 5th, 1864. Savas Beatty is the publisher. And our friends at Savas would like to thank everyone for adapting to the current normal and for participating in the event tonight. So when you order Jerry's book from www.savasbeatty.com from their website, you can add the code that Tina's entering in the chat box at checkout, and you will receive 20% off of not only Jerry's book, but every book that you put in your cart. And so you just load his book in there first. That's what we ask. Enter the code when you check out, and you can buy as many books as you'd like and receive the 20% off discount. That's a really nice thing for them to do, and we really appreciate their partnership in this, helping round up the authors for these programs, and also for providing that discount. And Tina's entering that code now, and be sure that you use all caps. Next week we have Scott Mingus and his new book, Targeted Tracks, the Cumberland Valley Railroad in the Civil War. On November 11th, Ron Kirkwood on the George Spangler Farm in the Battle of Gettysburg. November 18th, Ken Rutherford on landmines in the Civil War, which I'm looking forward to. And our lineup for the rest of the dates, we've got dates all the way into January. And I think we just booked another one today or yesterday. Ashley, can you nod and say yes or no? Not quite yet. So we've got another one coming for January that we don't quite have lined up yet, but we've got Steve Norder in December 2nd, Chris Loperfido on December 9th, Bradley Gottfried on the 16th, and John Corstein will be back on the 30th with us. And his program was so well received last time. I know that everybody will want to join us then. And of course, Lance Hertigan was great, even though we couldn't see him. So we're looking forward to seeing him this time when he comes back in January. So thanks for tuning in tonight. We'll see you back next week on November 4th for Scott Mingus with his Targeted Tracks, the Cumberland Valley Railroad in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And I hope you'll all join us then. See you next Wednesday.
Thanks, Laura.
It was excellent, Jerry. Excellent.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Really.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all.